Hello, Ruth Myers here. Thank you for attending. This topic for this discussion is post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, just one word about words. Some people prefer to say post-traumatic stress syndrome, which I can understand why people would like to avoid blaming or shaming people that have this condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome. But sometimes the word syndrome implies that it's an endogenous part, an intricate part of a person that will never go away. And to me, that's the difference between a syndrome and a disorder, is that a disorder is a painful situation that we hope to relieve and help the person recover from. So that's why I still stay with that old-fashioned terminology of PTSD rather than post-traumatic stress syndrome. But I mean no disrespect to anybody who feels differently. There's all kinds of different ways to understand it, as long as we can all agree on the idea that it's a very, very painful condition, and when we work together, there's a very, very good chance of recovery. My initial introduction to people with IDD who had post-traumatic stress disorder started very shortly after I started the project I was involved in Colorado. I might have mentioned in another seminar, we were a traveling team that was supposed to go see the people that were the most complicated in the state of Colorado after they had completed all the statewide deinstitutionalization and implementation of all the new rules around avoiding chemical restraints and mechanical restraints and holds and things like that. There was this tiny group of people with kind of big reputations that were still in pretty much restrictive settings, just not institutions, because the institutions had been ended by that time. And we're going back now to around 90, 91, that sort of an era when I was brand new and I was all in, I knew we could do this. And I knew a little bit. I also knew that I had teammates that knew a ton. So I figured, this is great. And somebody showed me some artwork that had been done by a guy named Todd. Todd, at 26, had the biggest reputation in the whole state. He destroyed a number of buildings. He had put 6 staff on permanent disability. He was violent in more than one way. One was these targeted, extremely violent attacks on certain types of staff members. And the other was these non-specific rages where he would suddenly, abruptly erupt into violence that destroyed everything around him. He also did this kind of disturbing artwork that showed pictures of, dripping knives and nooses and dismembered bodies and really scary looking occult witchcraft type symbols. And somebody said, yeah, we're going to see Todd, he's on our list, and what do you think about this art? And I said, well, it sounds like a good thing that we're going to go see Todd and see what we can do for him. And next thing I heard was that Todd had been rehospitalized in an acute psychiatric facility. And it wasn't actually because of the extreme episodes of aggression and violence. It was because at the group living situation, the group home for the violent ones, we still had some of those in the late 1980s in Colorado, he had a ritual where every night he would urinate in all the edges and corners of his bedroom, and he would rip holes in his mattress and pillow and urinate in those holes, so his mattress and his pillow was always soaked with urine as well. And there's, as many of you may know, you can only clean that stuff so many times before it's just not cleanable. And the real reason that Todd landed in a hospital was that the health department threatened to close the group home if they didn't do something about this urination business. So I thought, well, he's in a locked psychiatric facility in a quiet, safe room. So how dangerous could it be? First of many mistakes, right? If we look at the statistics, locked facilities, safe rooms, seclusion rooms, and restraints do not make people safer. But I was very early on in my career. That was the first of many mistakes. So I thought, yeah, I haven't done any homework on him. Big mistake. But he's in the hospital. He's totally secure. I'll go in and see him, which I could because he was at University Hospital and I was on the faculty at that time. So I went in and to see him, and he's in the quiet room, and he was perfectly pleasant to visit with. And he had this really kind of engaging way of speaking. It was kind of like this. Hello, Ruth. How you doing? Now, of course, when I sit down with somebody, I'm not going to say, let's talk about your inappropriate behavior. No. We start talking about other stuff that I think the person hopefully finds more interesting, like, well, Todd, hey, nice to meet you. I'm Ruth. I'm a doctor. You can call me anything you like. What do you like to do for fun? Well, hello, Ruth. I like the Denver Broncos. Okay, so we talked sports for a little while. And I was thinking, I'm doing all right. Yeah, I got this. So I said, after a little bit more just really pleasant discussion, where Todd responded to every question as directly as possible. And I said, say, Todd, has anyone ever hurt you? And Todd had a rageful expression, said, Beverly, don't, picked me up by my shoulders and threw me across the room. Now, there are times when I do not catch on, especially quick. So I, stand up and like, what did I just do? I go back over, Todd's kind of coming out of whatever it was he was in. I sit back down next to him and you know what I did. Todd, what happened? Todd, has anyone ever hurt you? And again, he developed this expression of rage, said, Beverly, don't, picked me up by my shoulders and threw me across the room. I did not ask him a third time that day. I'm already starting to have a really good idea that there's a lot more I need to know about this man, isn't there? Sometimes when a group of us get together and talk about this early time of first visiting with Todd, the very first question is, well, who the heck was Beverly? Beverly was a foster care provider. He was at Beverly's house from the age of 5 to 15. She was a Caucasian-appearing woman of medium stature and brown hair, just like all the 6 staff he'd put on permanent disability. She used to beat him with weapons and whips and chains, as well as, like I said, weapons like bats. And there were scars on his body that documented this atrocious abuse. Yet, the only way he got out of that situation was to become too big and too violent for Beverly to handle. So my flying lesson was what? Right? He was in the middle of a terrible flashback, and whose fault was it? Mine, for triggering him. And as you might imagine, as he and I got to know each other better, I apologized only about 400 times for triggering a flashback right in front of my eyes. Not once, but twice. What's that kind of deeply sophisticated type of a behavior support idea? if this makes a person suffer, stop doing it. I learned that, slowly. Well, you say, is that the whole story? Well, it does explain that one particular symptom, doesn't it? The beating up on people that look a certain way and may say a certain trigger word. Does that explain the issue of destroying everything around him? Does it explain the urination in the corners? Does it explain the horrifying artwork? Maybe, but we're not done figuring stuff out, are we? Well, by the way, he's in this hospital, and the recommendation on the part of the inpatient team is, and you'll still hear this thinking from time to time, somebody's got big symptoms, we obviously need a bigger building. So their thought was that he should go to a locked psychiatric facility for a long-term inpatient treatment. And the public psychiatric hospitals in that part of the country were fantastic. It wasn't a sadistic or punitive recommendation. It's just what people thought they had to do. Well, does he have any other experience of inpatient psychiatric facilities? Well, it turned out that when he left Beverly's, when he was about 15, he was hospitalized in an adolescent psychiatric hospital where several personnel were later arrested because what they did was tie the adolescents down in mechanical restraints and sexually assault them. And later, not that moment, later, when I asked Todd more about what had happened, and I asked him, how come you do that peeing thing? Which unfortunately had been misattributed to developmental disability, had been misattributed to Asperger's syndrome, which was the diagnosis he had. Does either Asperger's syndrome or any form of autistic disorder or autism spectrum disorder cause people to urinate in the corners of their room or their mattress or their pillow? No. It turned out that for him, like for sadly a large number of other people, the response was, if I smell like piss, they'll leave me alone. That was the only way he could defend himself when he was being tied down in restraints and sexually abused. Okay, I think we kind of get the urination thing. But what about this non-specific busting stuff up thing? Have we explained that yet? Maybe. But what else can look exactly like a post-traumatic stress disorder flashback, and in fact comes from the same piece of brain real estate? Well, people with autism spectrum conditions are more vulnerable to certain types of rare seizures, aren't they? So we should at least try to make sure he doesn't have temporal lobe epilepsy, right? Well, it turns out he'd already had 3 EEGs to check that out. And as we described in a previous seminar, EEGs almost always miss temporal lobe epilepsy. However, in his case, all 3 EEGs showed the temporal lobe focus, but he was not receiving treatment for the epilepsy. And I think that the reason is what we see not uncommonly is that people get so caught up in one idea about one set of symptoms that they forget to be thorough. It stands to reason, doesn't it? If somebody has such a gigantic reputation, the answers are not going to be simple-minded. They're not going to be one thing. And so we kind of got a lot of stuff kind of figured out. But if I were showing you his picture, you would see that he always buttons his collars way up to the top. The first picture I had of him from when he was 26, right after we first met. And he always, always covered his chest in trunk. He didn't even like to take a shower without a t-shirt on. Well, what's that about? We still haven't quite figured out this artwork, have we? Finally, through an informant that was an extended family member, and then later confirmed on exam, it turned out that the reason he landed in foster care was that he was being physically and sexually tortured by multiple family members with prominent occult themes. And some of the stuff that was in his artwork conformed to stuff that had been carved onto his body. So this information didn't emerge all at the same time. And forever after, there will be people that probably want to dispute it, although the objective evidence is pretty impressive. But even more importantly, what do we do with all this information? First of all, the suggestion on the table from people that are pretty darn proficient is saying, he needs a locked inpatient facility, and he needs it for a long time because he's dangerous. Do we ever hear that stuff? But backing up, what is it that makes him dangerous? Coercion, any form of coercion, or even people triggering him. So, in fact, what kind of place should he live in? Who should choose? How about him? And he's getting a little bit of this is how old this story is. He's getting a little bit of a ancient medicine called Mellaril, which is gets pulled off the market every other year or so because it's kind of toxic. But it was pushed a lot on people with developmental disabilities as sort of it's kind of a slightly more toxic version of Thorazine, and not a direct treatment, obviously, for seizures or anything else. What does he need treatment for? How about we treat those seizures, huh? And since he doesn't need Mellaril, and all it does is make you feel kind of, what's that technical term, crappy, how about we get rid of that? And what kind of people should be his direct support professionals? Who should choose them? How about him? And if you're trying to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, does that just sort of happen when you have a nice life and nice people in your life? Or do you need to do something else about it? Well, yeah, he needed therapy, and he was already an ideal candidate for art psychotherapy. So, for certain treatment systems, this seemed almost insane. You have a guy with the biggest reputation for violence in the entire system. And what you want to do is let him choose to live wherever he wants to live and choose whoever he wants to work with and do whatever he wants with his day. You want to take away the sedating medicine and instead give him a medicine that'll help him feel cognitively and physically stronger. This was not an easy sell, but in fact turns out to be the foundation of what's required if people are going to ever recover from severe trauma. So as you might imagine, there was a little bit of scrutiny on this particular individual, big reputation, biggest one in the state. What do you think happened? Was it an unmitigated disaster? Well, within a couple of months, he was living in the place he wanted to live in. He wanted to live in his own little house with nobody else. The only staff he hired were people that looked like they'd been rejected from the Denver Broncos for being too big and strong. They were huge, and these were the people he chose that he felt safe with. In an interview with me, a couple weeks later, a video interview. He brought one of them with me. And it's always funny because when people that don't know the story see the video, they see him talking with me and this gigantic man in the background. And they always start with the assumption that the man is there to make me feel safe. But that's not it, is it? Not for Todd. For Todd, he was there to make him feel safe because I was the dangerous one in the room. But Todd, God bless him, when he heard I was doing videotaped interviews, he volunteered. He insisted on participating and telling his story, which gives you a little bit of an inkling of what happened next. Todd enrolled in art psychotherapy. Now, in that era, in that state, it was still a big, hairy deal to be able to get psychotherapy for a person with a developmental disability. There were still too many people saying, you can't do it can't be done, blah, blah, blah. But we were able to push and get a special benefit for him to work with an art psychotherapist. And he, as you might guess, had already been trying to heal himself with art. So when he had a therapist to help him do it, the results were spectacular. And one of the next things he did was that, we'd had to get this special benefit, and he recovered so fast that he still had a big bag of money left over. His idea of what he could have done anything he wanted to with that bag of money. His idea for the bag of money was to start a fund for other moderates. He called people with moderate intellectual disability like him moderates, for other moderates that needed therapy and couldn't get it. And that fund operated for the next 30 years. He got a part-time job at a Denver Broncos souvenir shop. And over the years, other things changed as well. So for the first several years, he had his own little house, his own hand-picked staff, his part-time job, his art therapy, and that was that. Well, 10 years later, there has still not been any further episodes of aggression. His flashbacks, when they do occur, are much less intense, much less severe, and he feels like he can count on the guys he hired to look after him. Now, a few other things changed. Over those years, he recovered to the point where people didn't scare him so much. And he decided he was ready to take on one or two housemates, and did. He was able to receive and feel safe receiving support from staff members that looked like Beverly and me. So the cost to serve him, which was important to certain people in state government, the cost to serve him kept getting lower and lower. 10 years later, when he's not just in fear for his life every minute of the day, he turns out to be interested in astronomy, of all things. And the other thing that's an absolute essential for him every day is 8 cups of strong black coffee. And nobody gets to mess with that. And if I could show you his picture, it's him in his room with his 2 roommates off to the side, with his astronomy pictures on the wall and his gigantic coffee pot off to the side, ready for action. At this point, he's let the scars on his body heal finally, and he's not buttoning up to here anymore, but he still can't allow any cuffs on any of his shirts, and I think we could probably guess the reason why. All this time, there's been no attacks on people. There's been no explosive destroying of things around him. He no longer has to mark his territory with urine to feel safe. He has a hobby he enjoys. He has a job he enjoys. And I think to myself, this is a pretty darn good recovery for a guy they wanted to lock away forever. So, is there anything left? I mean, what else is there? Well, for a full and complete recovery and a wonderful life, a person is also probably going to be interested in intimate relationships, right? Not just good friendships, but love and sex and stuff. But I thought to myself, with the amount of torture this man has endured, why should I have that expectation? Why should I have that hope? But then I remembered, people with the strength to survive that kind of torture have the strength to do just about anything when they heal. And a few years later, by this time, Todd typically stops by my office, which was a kind of a crappy old Victorian in a crappy old neighborhood in Denver, downtown Denver. He'd drop by every so often, and we'd sit there and drink black coffee together because we have the same vice. And we talk about stuff. And 15 years later, I have a picture of him sitting in my office with me. We're both drinking coffee. And he's letting his hair grow in more naturally. He'd previously shaved everything. Letting his eyebrows grow in. And he said he was letting his hair grow and he's learning how to cook because he heard that women like men who know how to cook. So even that part of recovery seemed to be a possibility. Well, I moved away from Colorado, but I know Todd's psychiatrist, and she keeps me informed. 25 years later, Todd is living with the love of his life, and they have a beautiful, harmonious relationship. He's been symptom-free for all these decades. I remember once, very shortly after he left the hospital, he grocery shopped at the same place I did. And we saw each other in the frozen foods once. And good to see you, sweetheart. Glad you're out. And he said, "Hello, Ruth. Now I'm lifting boxes instead of you." He still felt bad, even though I was the one who triggered him to throw me across the room. But this is kind of, in my opinion, the sort of recovery that we can expect and help people achieve when they're strong enough to have survived the tortures that produce the post-traumatic stress disorder. So many people would absolutely have not survived all the things that Todd survived. So to review, and many of you have heard this in many other seminars, depending on sample, between 66 to 100% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are subjected to severe abuse or some other trauma. I focus a lot on abuse because that is the most frequent type of trauma. The percentage of people that will develop post-traumatic stress disorder in response to trauma is right around 15 to 20%. People with IDD subjected to trauma that will develop the full syndrome textbook version of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is about the same as in the general population of people subjected to severe trauma. This percentage about will go on to develop the full syndrome of PTSD. There are other sequelae of unresolved trauma, and in some of the seminars where we talk about stress and toxic stress, we talk about what some of those outcomes are for people from a physiologic standpoint. Post-traumatic stress disorder can be treated no matter what the person's communication style. I am still dismayed when I hear, particularly psychotherapists who should know better, that say, well, I can't treat a person if they don't talk. Why not? Everybody communicates. And whose responsibility is it to bond with the person you're trying to treat? There's always a communication transaction that can be created, and it doesn't have to be sophisticated or expensive. One of the essential components of successful treatment is how the person is treated by their staff. That's what I'm going to focus quite a bit on in this discussion, is everyday ways that a person's life space and support strategies can help accelerate their recovery. We're going to have a separate seminar on psychotherapy, focusing on people that communicate without speech. So I'll defer some of that part of the discussion to that other seminar. So these are the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Presence of a traumatic event, and there's no subtlety in regards to the traumatic events we're talking about. Sadly, there was a brief era where people were describing events that are very stressful, very painful, but not overtly traumatic, and trying to stick those in the same category. And unfortunately, that dilutes the effectiveness of the different kinds of intervention strategies. If a person really doesn't have post-traumatic stress disorder, the treatment that they need to recover is considerably different than what we would offer a person who truly has post-traumatic stress disorder. Persistent re-experiencing of the event, which is where the person has flashbacks. That is the classic symptom of PTSD that makes it different than many other trauma spectrum issues. Either part or all of the event is re-experienced by the person in response to conscious or unconscious triggers. People will also avoid stimuli associated with the event. So resisting being around rooms that are certain colors, or people that look a certain way will be intrinsically trauma triggering for certain individuals. Persistent hyperarousal, and this is why for many, many years PTSD was classified as an anxiety disorder. And when we looked at all those very colorful brains in the trauma-informed care lectures, and we looked at how the brain is partially lit up all the time for people with active PTSD, we see in that situation how the brain is ready to explode at any time. There's no peaceful, quiet brain time for a person with PTSD. Has to last more than a month because a lot of these symptoms plague people after a very, very scary, stressful, traumatic event for a few weeks, but then they kind of go away. But for the people where it stays, then we're talking about PTSD. And the political criteria was significant impact on functioning. And this criterion was added because for a brief period of time, 80s, 90s, there was a cadre of people that were claiming PTSD and trying to get money for it that weren't really at all impacted by the trauma they'd experienced, or at least not in the ways that people get money for. When can PTSD show itself? You know, in the classic descriptions of wartime, where PTSD had a different name, it's called shell shock or battle fatigue. Often, people that were in the middle of the trauma were perfectly functional, calm as the ocean on a calm day. Yet, when they finally were off the battlefield, and in a place where they did not have to be battle ready, then the symptoms swept over them. The shaking, the explosiveness, the anxiety, the panic, the fearfulness, the terror. And it was very hard for people to understand why that was. But in a situation of extreme terror, there's fight, flight, or freeze. And for many people with a lot of very intensive training, there's also function, where people can, at a very superficial level, continue to function at what they're there for when the trauma is building up and ready to burst forward when the person finally lets their guard down. I remember a situation once where when I was working in a medical emergency room, an absolutely beautiful, beautiful child was brought into the emergency room in the midst of resuscitation. The baby had died in the crib, but of course everybody is working like crazy to resuscitate this child. And after the ambulance came in, a family came in waiting. It was a big extended family. And as soon as it was clear the baby was not going to be restored to life, the family just began to shout and howl and shriek and cry. And it was a beautiful lesson to me because, a certain cadre of people wanted to say, oh, we need to get them out of here. This is disruptive. This is blah, blah, blah. But God bless him. One of those wonderful, grizzled old security guards that was probably 1,000 years old said, you people back off. This is what they need to do right now. It was beautiful. It was just beautiful. Well, the next thing that had to happen is that some people wanted to see the baby. Others didn't. And I said, well, somebody has to hold this baby. We'll wrap the baby up, try and, not have all the tubes and all that awful stuff showing. Somebody needs to hold the baby so the families can see the baby. And I said, well, I'm pretty calm, cool, and collected. I'll be just fine. I'll hold the baby for the family members that want to see it before the funeral, or right now. And I was smooth. I was peaceful as glass. I was warm. I was loving to these horribly traumatized people. I had this beautiful, perfect baby in my arms, absorbing the pain and agony of the family. But hey, I was fine. I was totally fine. Absolutely fine. No problem here. Except I kept tripping over my own feet and calling everybody by the wrong name of my familiar coworkers. And even though it wasn't even my baby, wasn't my family, the sadness and the horror of it did affect me, even if I wasn't willing to acknowledge it. Which is why one of the most important aspects in helping people recover from severe trauma is to also work with everybody that's helping the person recover from severe trauma. Because you'd have to be a machine not to feel something. We'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. PTSD can start any time after the trauma, which can be very baffling because not uncommonly, the person may not show signs of PTSD until they're finally in a safe, beautiful, wonderful living situation. It's like, we did everything you want, and now you're having flashbacks and nightmares and screaming and throwing things? But that is, in fact, kind of how it works. When people finally can let their guard down and be safe, they start to express, sometimes. Sometimes it's earlier than that. Exaggerated reactions to current stressors can be a clue to unresolved trauma. When a person has just a little bit of a disruption in their day or a little disruption in their schedule, and they, technical term, go ballistic. That's typically doesn't have anything to do with right now. It has to do with bottled up, unresolved trauma from a long time ago. So to react with kindness can help open the door for the person to process what's really going on, whatever it actually is. Years ago, people used to say that people with IDD don't handle change well, which is absolute nonsense. People with IDD get jerked around more than any other group of human beings on earth, number one. And number two, because to get to the point of adulthood, people have to be especially resilient. If something is triggering a catastrophic reaction today, there's something else that we need to be aware of and work with, help that person heal. It can be triggered in terms of seemingly innocuous anniversaries, dates, milestones achieved by other family members, and also, sadly, can very definitely be triggered when perpetrators come back into the person's life. Why is it that we don't always get the story and almost never get the whole story? Well, stuff gets hushed up and it doesn't get prosecuted. Perpetrators choose victims that they believe won't be heard when they explain what happened, particularly if the person communicates without speech. In general, the first thing a person tells you that happened is the least toxic thing that happened. There's almost always more. Some people use what I call a screen test approach, where they're trying to check you out to see if you're really going to listen. So they tell you a story that's sort of like what happened to them, and your response determines whether or not you're going to get the truth. So somebody says, well, George Washington came back from the dead and beat the crap out of me 2 weeks ago. And if you respond with, well, that's just impossible, that's ridiculous, I know where you were 2 weeks ago, and that guy didn't, if you respond with an argument or a cross-examination, you failed the screen test. If, however, you say, tell me more about what happened, in whatever way the person communicates, eventually the correct story is much more likely to tumble out. People use a screen test to determine who's going to really listen and who's just going to cross-examine them. Cross-examination is not helpful. But encouraging people to tell their story their own way and then piecing it together is a lot more therapeutic. Does everyone exposed to trauma develop post-traumatic stress disorder? Of course not. There's all kinds of different outcomes that can be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Mike, for example, is a 21-year-old guy who was beaten senseless by his biological father over and over and over again. And Mike, like a lot of people, had a presenting symptom of beating people up. Thing was, Mike wasn't scared at all. He didn't have nightmares. And his dad, who was in prison because he was a sociopath and not especially good at it, Mike admired his dad, the guy who beat him senseless, more than anybody else on earth. Mike was one of those few people who was a genuine psychopath. And he did have trauma in his background, although it wasn't necessary. That wasn't the reason that he became violent. He became violent and hurt people because he gets great pleasure from it. You can see, however, how if people don't take the time to really understand the person's motivations and pleasures, People might say, oh, he's just this traumatized guy that likes to beat people up, but he doesn't like it really. He feels really bad. Well, does he really? Does he really? The vast majority of people who've been abused do not go on to harm anybody else. And the very, very unusual, rarely seen sociopath may or may not have experienced abuse. Abuse might or might not inform how they express their sociopathy. But it certainly is not a determinant of sociopathy. So Mike's sequelae of trauma was a very distorted relationship with pain, because he loved his dad more than anything. And so he really liked painful stuff. Lots of piercings, lots of tattoos, done in ways not the way you would do it with a professional tattoo or piercing artist, but like homemade and with sticks and stuff like that. That was what happened to him as a result of trauma. And he went on to harm other people for reasons completely separate from trauma. One end of the continuum. One arbitrary way to look at life: body, mind, soul, and situation. And as we take into account all of these factors, we can then think about how can we help create a life space for a person that can encourage recovery. And one of those things, of course, is self-care. Now, in 2001, I made a firm, carved-in-stone decision that I was never doing another expert witness case. I'd done expert witness cases where they needed to import somebody who was a medical doctor to say, yes, when you torture people, it harms them, even if they have a developmental disability. Doesn't seem like that should be the case, right? But my experience as an expert witness may help inform some of the obstacles that we run into as we try to advocate for what people really need to recover and thrive and do well. So I was never, ever, 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 ever going to do another expert witness case. So I get this call from an attorney in New Orleans. His name was Bradford. Bradford from New Orleans said, now, Dr. Ryan, my last name was Ryan then. Now, Dr. Ryan, I would really like your expert witness services, blah, 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 for this man named Joseph, who was harmed. And his psychiatrist is a very, 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 very nice man, but feels uncomfortable making any sort of post-traumatic diagnosis in a person who is nonverbal. Could you be? And I said, absolutely not. I am not doing any more expert witness cases. They take a bajillion hours and they break my heart, and I just am not going to do any more of them. All right. Next day, he shows up at my office in Denver from New Orleans. Now, Dr. Ryan, I wanted to just get your advice face to face. Like, oh God. Joseph had had a long history of loud, nonsensical vocalizations. Communicates without speech. Stomps, waves his arms. He's kind of a loud guy. Not destructive, not assaultive, just loud. And one morning, he wouldn't get out of bed. The morning staff came in. He was living in a group home. Morning staff came in. I said, what, Joseph? Joseph normally would bound out of bed, go about his day. Real high energy guy. And so the staff member said, well, Joseph, and then she noticed that his sheets were sticking to his body. And discovered this on Joseph: 3rd degree burns on his backside, the underside of his scrotum, and his feet. These are photographs that were in court. And these were the photographs that Bradford showed to me, saying, now, Dr. Ryan, could you take a look at these photographs and tell me some advice on who I might consult? Right? So this is in the hospital. Joseph's just been brought in, just starting the assessment for what turned out to be horrific burns. Unexplained second and third degree burns. We were told there were no witnesses. Lives in a group home. How can there be no witnesses? Doesn't draw or paint. Communicates without speech. How do we figure out what happened? And what are we going to do for him? Because what also happened is that these burns made him terrified at all times. Keeping in mind, just physiologically speaking, any kind of burn, significant burn injury, produces the same impact no matter if it's an accident or a purposeful burn. Burns are inherently a traumatic stimulus. So first, of course, we try and consult with the staff that work with him in this group home, who are being sued, by the way. The family is suing because they only want that his benefits be redirected to them so they can take care of him at home. That's what they're asking for. Yet, were they accused of wanting a big payday? Were they accused of all kinds of other bad things? They were. They were the most wholesome people you ever met in your life. One ran a elementary school cafeteria and the other one roasted coffee. Yeah, I'm not thinking. So the first story that we got from the staff is that he did this to himself. Well, how exactly did that happen? He ran his own boiling hot bath, stepped into the bath, and sat down in the steaming, boiling hot water. On purpose. Anybody buying that idea? Of course not. This is an incredibly agile, athletic, sensitive man. The minute he had one toe in excessively hot water, he was out. So that didn't make any sense. Well, maybe that isn't what happened. And we're also going, how come the governor wasn't working? As you know, in living situations, there's supposed to be a governor on the water temperature, so it can't get hot enough to cause that kind of injury. It's just a standard procedure. So how come that was off? Well, then the next story they provided was that his roommates did it to him. Well, how do we check into that? Well, it turns out that none of them have the physical capability, nor do they have the personality where they would ever even walk in on somebody in the bathroom, much less do a horrible, painful, hostile thing to them. Yet, when we try to help people with IDD who've been traumatized, usually abused, usually by people in a position of trust, these are some of the fairy tales that are consistently shared while we're trying to get the real information. So then we were able to show that no, somebody ran this steaming hot bath and forced him into it and held him down. It's the only way this could have happened. They didn't want to believe me with my forensic background, so I got a super, super duper forensic pathologist who said, yep, that's exactly what happened. He was held down in a boiling hot tub of bath water, burned the bottom of his feet, his backside, the underside of his scrotum. So they had to stipulate to that because there was no other explanation. Then the people that were trying to defend the perpetrators, the attorneys, said that, well, since he has a profound intellectual disability, it doesn't really bother him, right? Does torture hurt human beings? Yes, of course it does. It doesn't matter what your IQ is. And then, when they had to stipulate to, oh yeah, he is a human being, they said, well, there's no damages because his life didn't have any monetary value anyway. This systematic dehumanizing response from the defense attorneys, from the people who had perpetrated this crime, is sadly as bad now as it was when I first started working with people in 1973. And it's debilitating for those of us that are in a person's corner trying to help them. But share it a lot. You will run into this, you have run into this. Don't keep it to yourself, don't keep it inside. It's an outrage. And the more we can process it together, the more we can share ways to fight it and help the person win. So how do we find out what happened and if it upset him? Well, I just started to be just in a very fairly friendly relationship with the guy I had been in shouting matches with, the behavior analyst, because the other thing they wanted to say, well, even if this did happen, it's all behavioral, all the stuff he's doing now, the screaming and shouting and hiding and clinging on to his parents, that's all just behavioral stuff. So we'll just get a behavior analyst and that'll fix him right up. Well, Steve, who admitted to being a traditional BCBA behavior analyst, you guys, many of you have already met him, you know the story. We didn't get along very well. We argued a lot professionally. We became sort of good friends. And after all that fighting and yelling and screaming, 3 years later, we were married. It was not the way it usually goes. But anyway, he came with me to be the behaviorist perspective, because they were trying to say, oh no, this isn't post-trauma. This is just him being behavioral, trying to who knows what. So first thing we did when we went to Joseph's house, and these are the trauma questions, we went to his house. Do we ask these questions verbally of people that communicate without speech? Sure. Well, almost everybody understands way more than they can express, right? And these are the basic questions. Has anyone ever hurt you? Keep it very simple. Some of the more standard interview protocols have these way long questions where most of us lose track of what's being asked halfway through it. Like, has anybody in a position of trust, maybe a staff member or family member, caused you to feel as though you were uncomfortable? Or who can follow that? Has anyone ever hurt you? People will tell about trauma. They might tell about nothing. They might tell about nothing in a way that tells you it's something. No, nothing. Nobody ever hurt me. Or they may tell you about a more benign situation. Oh yeah, it hurt my feelings when my friend didn't show up. All right, that's cool. That shows good insight, and it's also not trauma, thankfully. Has anyone ever hit you? Simple, clear interviewing. How did and then you let the person's body teach you. I will see fractures that haven't been set. I will see scars from burns, divots, other kinds of injury sequelae. And if they're not really sensibly explained in the person's medical record, it's stuff I can follow up on. Honey, can you show me how this happened? When I see a person who's had a broken arm that was clearly not set properly. Sometimes people will act it out. Sometimes people will gesture it. Sometimes people will point across the room at the person who broke their arm. Has anyone made you scared? Anyone made you scared? And some of the more, kind of benign responses is, yeah, scary movie, or yeah, haunted house. And those are, kind of relief type responses. However, other responses can be quite ominous, right? Have you ever been told you got to keep a secret? These are the basic interviewing questions. And then depending on what the person says, following up. When I have a pretty good idea that somebody has been harmed because they have a scar, or there's a police report or something that suggests that harm has taken place, and they initially say no, number one, if I already know the story, I'm not going to ask them to tell it to me again. But number two, if I don't really know the story, but I have a suggestion from the examination, I'll say, can you tell me about this? Or, I heard there was a terrible burn on your backside. What happened? Keeping it very simple, easy to follow, and not arguing with whatever the person says. If they say they got burned by Halley's Comet, ask them to tell you all about it until the real story emerges. What are some of the tools we might use? Drawings, gender-neutral human outlines, neutral dolls or figures. There's a lot of controversy about anatomically correct dolls. Dolls that have, really obvious adult genitalia that some skilled interviewers use to help young people, teach them about maybe some kind of sexual abuse that happened. There's a lot of controversy because some people feel like the dolls themselves may suggest stories that aren't really consistent with the person's experience. I'm not sure. I tend to be very extra cautious, so I use very neutral figures and neutral objects to try and get that information. So Joseph, as we already talked about, he doesn't communicate with speech, and he doesn't draw. And so I come to visit him at his home. His wonderful mom is there at the house. And the only thing I knew was that the expert witnesses for the defense had already come by and stopped in for a few minutes and then left. Well, we came, Steve and I came to visit him at his house, and Bradford is there with us. I'm serious. Panama hat, seersucker suit, the whole thing. It was a beautiful thing. He shows up, and the first thing, I kneel down next to Joseph, who's sitting in a chair in his family living room, and he turns away from me, turns his face away from me. Now, was that because of his developmental disability? Oh, heck no. There was a good reason why he responded to another so-called expert witness that way. So I took a guess. I said, Joseph, I want you to know we will absolutely not disrespect your parents. And he spun around and started engaging, just like that. I had guessed, but I didn't know, that the original expert witnesses had been incredibly rude to Joseph's parents, and they had been, I found out later. Disrespectful, rude. They are the ones that accused the family of trying to cash in on a big old payday, and all they wanted to do was keep Joseph safe for the rest of his life. So he engaged, and we chit-chatted about things in the way, he did with gestures and movements and expressions. And then we started walking around his house. He showed me around the house and showed me his room, some sports stuff that he likes. And I then asked him very directly, I pointed at one of the scars. By this time, the burns have healed, but he's got very extensive scarring. I just gently pointed at the scarring. I said, honey, can you tell us how that happened? And he froze. He just froze. And then his mom said, well, let's see if I can help. And she came and he clung on to her. And he didn't look quite so terrified, but he also didn't respond to any further direct questions. So I said, Joseph, can you show me with Steve what happened to you? And he said, okay. And so I said, first, show me where it happened. And he led Steve into his bathroom. I said, okay, show me what happened next. And he showed all the time holding his mom's hand. He showed me turning on the hot water. And I pointed at the cold water and he said no. I said, what happened next? And he showed me trying to leave. And I said, what happened next? And he took Steve and told Steve, get in the tub. I said, which way? And he positioned Steve through gestures. And the gestures showed that he'd been forcibly picked up and put in the tub and held down. And he modeled all of this on Steve in his dry tub. And then he began to weep, as did his mother. And we said we were very, very sorry. And we described all of this. So I thought his report was absolutely perfectly accurate and reliable. It exactly corresponded to what had happened to his body. It exactly corresponded to how he was behaving, very, very traumatized. And I also could see, as anybody could, that he felt safe with his mom, and I was sure his dad too. I didn't meet his dad then, but nice, I mean, just the nicest people on the face of the earth. Well, they wanted to say there were no witnesses, but there were witnesses, weren't there? The other people he lives with, people with intellectual disabilities, little bit of verbal capacity, little bit of lots of nonverbal communication. This is one of the coolest things I ever saw a lawyer do. He said, well, I want to take the depositions of the witnesses, but I don't know how to interview people with developmental disabilities. And it was a good question because in a typical deposition, they start out with a whole crap load, that's a technical, I'm sorry, a whole bunch of biographical questions, you know, who was your first grade teacher, where'd you go to high school, blah, blah, blah. And in my opinion, those things don't really establish anything other than trying to make the person tired who's responding to the questions, right? Then they follow with sort of important questions. Were you present on the day, blah, blah, blah. Well, nailing down dates is not an easy thing for a person with a developmental disability, is it? It's not because of their intellect, it's because of anxiety, but we can get into that discussion later. And then they follow up with the hardest questions when the person's the most tired and try and trip the person up and argue with them. Well, you're not going to get any information out of his roommates using this procedure. They'd been traumatized by what he went through, and this kind of a deposition would not work. So what are the adaptations? And we characterize this as ADA required adaptations. So the defense attorneys couldn't really argue, could they? Unless they, of course, wanted to violate some more federal law. The preliminary questions were for alliance building only to help the people react or relax. And it was something to see Bradford. He was amazing. He said, "So, young man, I hear you like the New Orleans Saints. Now, what are we going to do about getting them to play better?" And the person laughed, and it was a perfectly relaxed moment. "Well, can you tell me what happened to Joseph?" Well, the person starts out at the other part of the story. "Well, he went to the hospital." "Oh, yeah? Tell me, how'd that come about?" Instead of trying to force the person to tell the story in order, they start wherever the person can start and then round back and then put together a beautifully coherent narrative, staying away from yes or no questions, right? Because people will get into a yes or no rhythm and they'll start saying yes, 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 or no, 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 and stop listening to the questions. So flew in the face of some of the things that had been out there. People thought, well, you can't ask open-ended questions of people with developmental disabilities. Well, that's just not true. It's better to ask open-ended questions. It's just that you gotta wait longer for the answer. For a person with moderate, severe, or profound intellectual disability to conjure up an answer to an open-ended question that they've never answered before takes about 6 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but in ordinary conversation, it feels like an eternity. But this wonderful, wonderful attorney in New Orleans, he did it. And he got a very coherent, consistent narrative from Joseph's 2 housemates that agreed to be deposed. And they were exactly consistent with each other. What do we do next? How do we help a person heal and recover? Well, we talked about Joseph and the way we kind of figured out the story. His body told us the story. His gestures, he told us the story as best he could. Another fella, guy named Benny Jack, 46 years old, right? We were asked to see him for evaluation of 2 types of seizures. One type of seizure was pretty classic partial complex seizures with that followed a very, very repeatable pattern. First he would look like this, then he would do like this, and then he'd run around, and then he'd collapse and fall asleep for sometimes hours. Very classic partial complex seizures that responded nicely to anti-epileptic medication. But what do we say about real estate, brain real estate? He had other types of episodes that were not at all improved by anti-epileptic medications. Well, tell us about those spells. Well, similarly, he'd get this blank, terrified look, jump up, and start running around the house, start digging at the carpet. And we asked them to videotape this episode for us, if they could. And they said, yeah, we can do that. And when we were meeting him and looking at this video for the first time, I was very impressed by the way he was when we met him. That traveling team I was on, we were pretty nice. We tried to make things kind of fun if we could. Yet as soon as he saw us, strangers, he hid like this and cowered in the corner. And no amount of charm from my teammates helped him relax. So we said, well, Benny Jack, and we tried to talk with him and visit with him. He communicates without speech, but he wasn't having any of it. Scared to death. "I'm so sorry, honey. We're really scaring you. I'm really sorry about that. We'll step away. We'll try another way another day." And as we're leaving, we say to the people that provide support to him, "Did something ever happen to him?" And this is before we had our statistics that showed that it was probably 95% likely that the answer to that question was yes. This was very early on. They said, well, those of you that are therapists will recognize this expression. With their hands on the doorknob on the way out of the room, they said, well, this happened a long time ago. So we don't think it's important anymore. I'm sure he doesn't remember it. But Benny Jack was raped, sliced up with razor blades, and buried next to a train track to die when he was 12. And the second type of seizure happens every time a train goes by. Very clearly, of course. And then it all kind of made sense, right? The digging. Benny Jack was an incredible powerhouse of a human being to survive this. He was intended to bleed to death underground. Dug his way out, and the evidence was so overwhelming, the perpetrator, in fact, went to prison, which was unheard of in those days for somebody who attacked a person with a developmental disability. And he lived with people he likes, and he had staff members that absolutely adore him. He was in a great life space, but it had not taken away these horrible flashbacks. There was another person, another gal, her name's Carrie. Carrie's 21 years old, and she was referred to us for evaluation of inexplicable episodes of screaming, howling, shrieking, pulling away. She happened to have autism, and so people were trying to say these episodes were due to autism. Well, no. There's got to be something else going on. We visited with her, and again, she was like Benny Jack. Still, like, she thought for sure we were going to kill her any minute now. And we're, like I've said in other seminars, I'm kind of a cream puff. I'm just a jelly donut. I don't scare people. So for her to be so petrified meant there was a lot more to the story. And she happened to be wearing shorts that day, and we noticed there was a lot of scarring on her legs. And the person who came with her said, yeah, when she came to us from that treatment facility, they said she'd had a kind of a bad infection in her legs, and that's what that scarring is from. And the other physician and I looked at each other and said, they were burn scars. She clearly had dreadful burns from her knees down, both legs. And what do we say about burns? Even if it's accidental, it's still trauma. What are other clues to possible abuse? Early hysterectomy or sterilization was a common practice when children with developmental disabilities were sexually assaulted. Unexplained scars, like we talked about a little earlier. Frequent urinary tract infections without a real sensible cause. Hepatitis B or C, those are venereal diseases until proven otherwise. The common story that they got it from being bitten doesn't fly. People who have deformities of their rectal or genital areas, and people that hurt themselves during masturbation. People that try very hard to get their staff to hurt them are often people who've experienced severe abuse or other forms of trauma. I've also found, I'm sure you've seen this too, that for all kinds of different reasons, official records are often sanitized. So if I want to keep gathering more facts, if I don't quite know enough to help the person, I find it very helpful to interview people who worked in the places where people lived, if they're willing to talk. Other people who were friends of the family, neighbors, law enforcement personnel, social workers, teachers, and old disappeared reports. Not uncommonly, particularly during the class action lawsuit era, there would be two sets of records, the records that went to the attorneys and the records that said what really happened. And getting access to those records could be extremely, extremely helpful. So we developed a protocol for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in people with developmental disabilities that was based on what seemed to work for anybody else with PTSD, with special additions or emphases related to the lifestyles and life spaces of people with IDD. That is, people who typically have a lot of other people in their life. Careful use of medications, which means medicines to treat whatever else is going on. If the person with PTSD also has asthma, we must treat the asthma properly for them to get the best possible recovery. And it's important in two ways. First, the physiologic stress of an untreated health problem interferes with the effectiveness of everything you do. And second, it's one of the myriad many ways we can show a person that they are worth our best effort. Appropriate psychotherapy, careful medical evaluation and treatment, like we talked about with Todd earlier. We could have just skated over the possibility of partial complex seizures, but then he wouldn't be in the amazing good situation he's in now, would he? And by the way, I should back up and mention that stupendous outcome that we're talking about with Todd, that can be the average outcome. I'm not just sharing the good stories and omitting a bajillion other bad stories. That's not how it is. These are the people that were strong enough to survive, got what they needed, and it wasn't perfect. It was pretty good, not perfect. They got what they needed, and this is the recovery we can expect as the average recovery. Appropriate psychotherapy, when we talk about psychotherapy in another section, we'll talk about that. Reduction of iatrogenic factors, that means treatment issues or treatment procedures that actually get in the way of healing and recovery. Habilitative changes, what do we need to help the person do in terms of their life space to produce a good outcome, and staff training and support. As you can see, each one of these pieces of the protocol must be absolutely individualized. There's no standard boilerplate cookbook, is there? And those of you that have helped people recover know exactly what I mean. One other factor, and I don't have a perfect word for it, but maybe I have sort of a word for it. Tino was 34 years old. I saw him for the first time when he was 18, and he was being badly beaten by both of his parents. They just apparently got amusement and sport from just beating on this poor young man when he was 18. And he happened to have also Tourette's syndrome, and he showed in his Tourette's echopraxia, which is the unintentional mimicking of other people's behavior, he showed what was being done to him. We went to court time after time to try and get these abusers out of his life and get him someplace safe. Time after time after time, the judge said, oh no, it couldn't be like that, and these people seem like the nicest people, and blah, blah, blah. Until one time when Tino went into court, needed to go to the bathroom, his father took him into the bathroom and beat him in the bathroom while the judge was in another stall, because the judge's own bathroom was out of order. That's when he finally believed. So Tino just had a stupendous recovery. As soon as he got to live someplace safe, and as soon as he knew he never had to see those people ever again, he really thrived. He even started to speak, which nobody expected. He learned to rollerblade like one trial, and the guy was amazing. When he was about 34 years old, I see on here I said he was 21 when we met. He was actually 18. He was 21 when the court thing happened, where the judge saw what the parents were doing to him. So it was 3 years of going back and forth to court that he waded through. 34 years old, we're sitting down to have a celebration meeting, basically. What amazing thing did Tino learn to do? And of all people, one of the perpetrators shows up. His mother shows up to the meeting. Although there was a court order saying she couldn't be there, she turned up and tried to come into the room where the gathering was. What do we do? Well, some people say, and I kind of get how they get here, some people say, well, we would support Tino to tell her that she has to leave. It's not the right answer, is it? What does he need to know about the people in his life? They're loyal. They will defend him. So fortunately, the people in his life knew better, and they just immediately got her out of there, called the police. They made it very, very clear to Tino that we are not letting any of that back into your life. And people say, well, isn't that like doing for instead of doing with? Not exactly. We need to take a stand in a very vigorous, clear, unambiguous way. If the people I'm paying to help me won't take a stand, how could I ever have the courage to take a stand? But watching that happen, it's like he grew 6 more inches that day. And he felt absolutely invincible because he knew those were the people around him. So I think the word is loyalty. There's probably a better word. I know you guys will think of one. So in terms of things we offer a person every day, the first step is to make sure the person is physically safe. And this has been one of the strangest areas of resistance I think we've all dealt with. Okay, the person is living in a place where they're abusive and neglectful. They need to leave. Right now. They want to leave. It's not like we're forcing them. This person has said in every way they can communicate they want out. When they're out, they do well. Yet, I don't know why, this is an idea that circulates around certain parts of the judicial system. It's the idea that reunification of families is always a good thing. And it's wrong. That's just wrong. Absolutely wrong. 100% wrong. It's an idea that refuses to die. And in fact, forcing reunification with a perpetrator will very likely cause irreparable harm, even if the perpetrator never perpetrates again. Because what's happening is the judge is saying, well, on some level, what they did to you is okay. That's why we're sending you back to it. That's the communication that's received by many people in that situation. So the first step, and sometimes weirdly the hardest step, is to make sure the person is in a safe living situation. For Joseph, what's the safe living situation? His family. His family. The rest of the protocol is at least as important as medications. So we treat the person for their other health problems. If a person has depression or bipolar disorder or seizures or whatever else they have, make sure they're getting proper treatment for it. Again, what do we say? That's 2 levels of recovery. First, to help their body be as well as possible. And second, to show the person that they're worth every effort we can make. When a person is in the middle of a flashback, what are the things we can do? Well, things we do for any other terrifying, involuntary neurophysiologic event, as with a severe seizure, for example. Make the environment safe. Take a snapshot of the environment. What in the world just happened that might have triggered this? Try and engage with the person. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Honey, it's safe. It's 2023. I'm here. It's Ruth. I'm with you. Where's those perpetrators? I'm going to get them. We'll all fight them off for you. Anything you can think of to try and engage with the person. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. It's always worth trying. Psychotherapy, depending on what the person needs. helping the person create their own home. And some of the things people need to feel safe are baffling to other people, but that's okay. Several people I've worked with, for example, always wore their street clothes, including their shoes, to bed. And it took years of recovery before they felt safe just wearing pajamas or nightgowns. Some people always slept under their bed with a barrier on either side until they finally recovered and felt safe enough to sleep in a bed. Now, we don't say to a person, now our goal is for you to wear pajamas to bed. Certainly not. What we're hoping for is to understand the reason for the street clothes in bed is trauma, and we will observe to see if helping you recover makes any changes in that particular self-defense strategy, and it might not. Well, for Benny Jack, none of that stuff worked. All the kindness, the nurturing, let's engage with you. Well, the first idea some people had is, well, the train going by, the train whistle is a trauma trigger. So how about Benny Jack not have to live by a train? That seems like a pretty logical way to respond, doesn't it? But Benny Jack loved where he lived. He loved his staff. Some of those people had been in his life for 15, 20 years. He loved his housemates. It should have been the totally wrong setting. It was a group home of 8 unrelated men of a certain age, but they all chose each other. Okay. They chose their staff. Okay. So, shouldn't have worked. It's a flawed model, but they made it into their model, and he didn't want to move. Okay. Well, now what? What are we going to do? Well, is it possible that maybe Benny Jack had already figured out a way to shorten up those flashbacks? I mean, he's getting treatment of seizures, he's getting psychotherapy with a really good therapist, he's getting off all the unneeded medicines, he's getting treatment for his high blood pressure with a medicine that doesn't make his mood worse, blah, blah, blah. All that's being done, but he's still having these flashbacks when the train goes by? Well, maybe he has already figured this out. So let's look back in his history. Has there ever been something that a behaviorist thought was an inappropriate behavior that now, viewed in context, maybe had usefulness? So it turns out that 5, 10 years prior, more like 10, he had been described as having inappropriate shower taking. What does that mean? Sometimes 6 or 7 showers a day. He would take a long, warm shower, and nobody could understand why. He's perfectly clean. There was no information to support this, but the people that worked there at the time said, that really did kind of correlate with when the train went by. And during that time, he did not have these flashback episodes. So in fact, he had figured out a way to abbreviate flashbacks. So the cure for him was to be invited back to take showers anytime he wanted to. And of course, one person who heard this story said, "Oh, great, Ruth. You take away PTSD and you give him obsessive compulsive disorder and prune skin." No, it's a bridge. Because as all the other treatments work, he's going to have less and less need for this coping strategy, which is exactly what happened. Over the next few years, he went from taking 10 showers a day to taking 2 showers to just running warm water on his hand and his head to sticking his hands in the faucet to not needing anything at all. And when he wasn't so scared all the time, he actually turned out to have a tremendous love of children. And so he spent his spare time going to be kind of a foster uncle for disadvantaged, abused children in the local receiving home. He just had didn't use speech to communicate, but he was like this total snuggle bear for all these children. He just had magic powers. Nobody knew he had them until there was a chance for his real personality to show itself. And he enjoyed this happy, peaceful lifestyle for the rest of his life. Now for Carrie, the basic stuff didn't help her either. The other thing is that we put out a call saying, we need more information about, if we can get it, about these burns on her lower legs. How in the world did that happen? Well, her mother was living in a different state, and we later learned that the reason was that Carrie had ordered her mother out of her life. So Carrie lived in Colorado, her mother lived out of state. But we contacted her and said, do you have any information? Do I have information? Oh my, yes. And she jumped on an airplane with a suitcase full of paper that said chapter and verse exactly what had happened to Carrie, which is when she was about 4 or 5 years old, she had been admitted to what was supposed to be a super advanced, super sophisticated treatment facility for little kids with autism, promised to make those kids with autism basically totally functional in society. Nobody would ever know, kind of a deal. And that was pushed on Carrie's mother as, if you're a good mother, you'll find a way to get this facility. The facility was still in a third state. Well, the next phone call several months later was Carrie's mother was told, your daughter's in the burn unit. Well, she managed to get the information that showed that this place didn't really provide any treatment. All it did was torture these little kids with autism. And one of the things they did was boil water in a great big soup pot and take these little kids and dunk them in boiling water to discipline them, mostly to torture them. Carrie's burns became horribly infected, and she had to be hospitalized on the burn unit. And the burn unit at that time had a policy, pediatric burn unit, obviously very ill-informed policy, that because of infection control issues, no parents on the burn unit. In addition, because she supposedly had profound intellectual disability, the doctor treating her believed that little kids with profound developmental disability, only she used the R word, don't really feel pain. So she was treated for her third-degree burns in the burn unit, tied down in restraints, with no pain medicine. Carrie, in her way, held this against her mother and refused to have contact with her mother for the next 15 years. So offering Carrie warm showers, not going to do the job. When she came to see us and pulled her legs away and pulled away from us and like this, she didn't scream. So we asked for video of what that screaming looked like. And we looked at this video over and over and over again. And finally, what we realized was that the screaming, which was accompanied by her howling, pulling up her hands, pulling up her legs, slapping her knees, slapping the table, was accompanied by certain sounds in the background. We were able to figure out, with a lot of help, that the sounds were the hot water tap heating up and the coffee pot starting to percolate with boiling water. So we're thinking, well, this is kind of an obvious trigger, isn't it? Because at other times, when there was no water around at all, Carrie was kind of a goofball. And she had kind of a good personality, and she'd tease and play and goof around with people. But as soon as there was anything resembling hot water around her, she dissociated, became blank. Well, one of her housemates, she happened to live in a group living situation. Again, not ideal, but nice housemates, couple of them. One of her housemates, who was eavesdropping shamelessly, bless her heart, said, well, if Carrie's scared of hot water, Carrie ought to be in charge of hot water. All right. So that meant nobody could touch the hot water except Carrie, which meant she would walk in and turn off her colleagues' showers while they were in them. They'd go to work with soap in their hair. There was no coffee in that house. There was no tea in that house. The spaghetti might get dumped out long before it was done cooking, and they just decided to give it up. They eventually started preparing some meals away and just bringing them in done because Carrie was in charge of hot water. In fact, one time, Carrie showed a little bit of an inkling of who all she was underneath all that pain and terror when she figured out a way to turn off the hot water supply to the entire office building that her case management office was in. It was pretty cool. Okay, it wasn't cool, but I think it's pretty cool. So one day, after months and months of this, Carrie leaves work early, goes home, tells the person who took her home, stay away for a while. Now, in retrospect, if that had happened and I knew about it right when it happened, I would have been scared of a lot of bad possibilities. But thankfully, I was flat wrong. Her housemates come home, and the first thing they see in the middle of the living room is soaked carpet and an empty bubble bath bottle. They go a little further into the house and they see that Carrie is in the most magnificent bubble bath you ever saw in your life. The suds are piled to the ceiling and she's pretty much flooded the house. And she's laughing and playing and splashing and pretty much destroying everything. So the people in her life have been around her with their not getting coffee and their uncooked spaghetti and their soap in their hair and their short showers. They've been going through this with her for 6 months, and they come home to discover that she's enjoying the heck out of hot water and has destroyed the house. How do you think that they responded? You know it. They were totally full of joy. It was so much cheering and whooping and hollering, and it was a gigantic celebration. And once Carrie felt safe enough, now all in the background, we're not just managing the hot water trigger, right? She's getting art psychotherapy. She is getting proper care for other health issues. But she's still absolutely refusing to see her mother. Absolutely refusing. Well, she was offered technology that has become more controversial than it should. She was offered the chance to use a bridging technique, and I'm very deliberate about saying it's a bridging technique called facilitated communication, where somebody helps steady her hand while she types. And she typed some stuff with the person helping to steady her hand. We thought, well, we'll have to look into this, see if it's really her communication or what. Subsequently, she no longer needed somebody to steady her hand, and she started to type and then write by hand independently. And then she was able to describe to us a whole lot of other horrible things that had happened. And with each opportunity to express that, the rest of her life was happier, more fun, more laughter, more function, more friends. She still has autism, but it doesn't really get in her way. Finally, after a couple years of pretty intensive support, she made it clear, and she wrote it down independently without anybody helping her, that she wanted to go live with her mother out of state. And they reunited, and then I managed to run into Carrie's next psychiatrist, the one who was working with her out of state, said that Carrie had a job and a boyfriend and was very, very happily living her life. So we know kind of generic ways we want to help a person when they're in the middle of a traumatic episode or in between traumatic episodes. We want to control triggers if we can. We want to offer them kindness and support and compassion and understanding. But sometimes we got to figure something out. And I call these idiosyncratic useful responses, right? Things the person may have used years ago that people didn't recognize as a trauma coping strategy, like Benny Jack with his showers. Or think about the actual trauma. Well, gosh, the first trauma for Carrie was being burned in boiling water and then being treated sadistically on a pediatric burn unit. Okay, let's see about being in charge of hot water in your life. And of course, it was one of her wonderful, insightful housemates that came up with the idea. Also important, isn't it, to consult with people who know the person well as the individual themselves. We'll have a separate seminar on recognition and avoidance of burnout. And I just want to mention for sure, it says, for crying out loud, would you just take a sick day for once in your life? Be good to yourselves. This is not lightweight work that you're doing. It's the most wonderful and fulfilling and exciting work to see people recover and thrive. But it's not light and fluffy either. A person's needs are best met by a person whose needs are met. Over controlling the person doesn't teach people anything you want them to learn. Abuse and other types of trauma occur more often. PTSD is one of the possible outcomes of severe trauma. There are many sources of information other than what we get in the basic records. Relationship is the most important component of successful support. That warm, optimistic, caring relationship. And each person's path to recovery is absolutely unique to that person. And for Joseph, how are we going to help him? How are we going to help him? And what would that look like at the end? How would he look once he's recovered from this horrific trauma? Well, I think the key is something we could see right at the beginning. This is one of those appalling, dreadful photographs from when he was brought to the emergency room, showing these just grim, dreadful burns. The skin, as you can see, has been peeled off because it was burned off and stuck onto to his sheets. Unspeakable pain. He'd also been abused by people that were punishing him for having Tourette's syndrome. That's what all the noises and the moves and the this and the that were about. Perfectly benign condition. Ran in his family. His family all knew that it was Tourette. It was perfectly benign. Yet he was being punished for it and ultimately tortured for it. But body, mind, soul situation. In his mind, he loves music and dancing. And we know when he's sufficiently recovered, that's what he'll return to, right? He's deeply loved by his very spiritual, very religious family. It's some of the most wholesome people you ever meet in your life. Where should he live and get treatment? As if it isn't already quite obvious. As you can see, this is Joseph in the middle as everybody's trying to help him with the burns. And what do you see to his left? You see a plaid shirt. Inside that plaid shirt is one of Joseph's brothers. And he clung to his brother for hours and hours and hours. Is it at all puzzling who he should spend the rest of his life with. Of course not. Wonderful, wonderful family. So, how'd it work? Well, within a couple of years, he was back to dancing, enjoying music, flirting. He was learning a few cooking skills. He wasn't scared of heat or baths or hot water anymore. He was flirting like crazy. Did I mention that? And by the way, this is not Joseph. This is Leslie Odom Jr. Could be Joseph's twin brother. This is how this man looked. And if you add a stupendously huge smile, you'll see how Joseph was going forward from the moment he finally was able to stay full-time with his family with really very minimal financial support. And he's made a full recovery, and that's how it can be, even in the grimmest of circumstances. I'll leave you with an idea that those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt the person doing it. In Joseph's family, they already knew what to do. They just needed the system to get out of the way. That is often the case. There's often a person who really gets it, really understands, who can help teach the rest of us as a circle how it can be most effective. And Judith Herman wrote a classic book called Trauma and Recovery. The survivor who has accomplished their recovery faces life with few illusions, but often with gratitude. They have a clear sense of what is important and what is not. Having encountered evil, they know how to cling to what is good. Having encountered the fear of death, they know how to celebrate life, and ultimately will teach everybody else. Thank you so much for attending.